Hello and welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbeville. World War II was won by men and women all pulling their weight, doing their job, whether it was fighting on the front lines or serving on the chow lines. When Bryan's W.S. Edmonds A&M class of 1938 enlisted in 1942, just 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he had field artillery in mind. He spent a lot of his early time in the Army training ragtag replacements stateside for overseas duty. But then his branch's orders were changed to postal duty, but sorting mail in Louisiana was not how W.S. Edmonds wanted to spend the war. If he was going to stay in the States, he wanted to be where the action was. So he got himself transferred to Washington, D.C., the Pentagon, a part of the Army's Courier Transport Service. It was mostly top secret. It had to get from one place to another, and W.S. Edmonds was one of the soldiers the Army depended on to get it there. Today, retired Major W.S. Edmonds and his wife, Ellie, live in Bryan, a proud past commander of the local American Legion and quartermaster of the VFW. Major Edmonds, welcome. Nice to have you here on the show. Let's go back to that part when you first enlisted, and you went to Fort Sill, and you were training just ragtag enlisted recruits.
Well, first I went to Camp Roberts in California.
Right.
Through basic training and then preparatory OCS. And then I was promoted to corporal. Then I went from there to OCS at Fort Sill, class of 39.
And you were training these recruits that were just pretty raw
well,
kids, right?
After I went through OCS as second lieutenant, I was assigned there at Fort Sill in the Training Replacement Center. Recruits were there for 6 weeks, training and all in basic training. It was the first time in the Army. Mm-hmm. So that was sometimes very interesting.
I bet it was. I mean, these were raw kids. I guess you had to get on them every once in a while, right?
Yes, I didn't have any trouble. We would, if anyone gave us any trouble, we'd go outside and drill, and the whole unit would go. So they kept everybody in line.
That kept them in shape. Now, as a member of the 102nd Division Artillery, at first you thought that you were preparing to go overseas, but,
yes, I did.
But then things changed real quickly.
I left Fort Sill and was assigned to the 102nd Division. They were on maneuvers in Louisiana. Mm-hmm. And I stayed there. Well, we went through maneuvers, and then they changed my branch of service to the AG.
Right. The Adjutant General's office changed it to Postal Service, and you would have gone to Louisiana, sorting mail in New Orleans, but that's not what you wanted to do.
Well, they wanted to send me overseas as a postal officer.
Right.
But that's what I didn't like, and so I was able to volunteer to go to Washington, D.C.
And what a fascinating job you had there as part of the War Courier Service. Talk a little bit about that. We talked about it earlier. It was a place you woke up every morning and had no idea where they were going to send you.
That's right. We were in the basement of the Pentagon, and we carried little bags with us in case we left that night or that evening. It was more or less a 24-hour job. During the day, most of the officers would go around to different places in the Pentagon building and pick up material. I made a number of trips during the day to the White House. Down in the basement, they had what they call the map room.
Yes, sir.
And you had to have a pretty good, they notified us, the guard, that we would be there.
Right.
And then they escorted us down to the map room. I never did get a look in that map room.
You tried to peek in there.
Well, that map room, kept a location of all the troops.
Exactly.
And it was a very top secret place.
I guess this is a place where President Roosevelt spent a lot of time managing the war at the time, right?
I never did see him there, of course.
Right, right.
But
this job, though, as a courier, it sent you everywhere. I know you told me that you went to New York City a dozen or times or more, and most of the time you went by train. A few times you got to fly.
Well, just a very few times by plane.
Right.
One time I went to Maine, and I flew back, I think, as far as Boston, and then got a train back into Washington, D.C.
And you would leave like in the afternoon. You'd leave Washington.
Generally, pick up stuff during the day there in the Pentagon. And then I suppose they would send that stuff out late in the evening or at night. So we might sit there all during the day and pick up stuff in the Pentagon. And then at night, while the major would look over there, and we didn't know who was going and who wasn't, and it designate one of us to, maybe it put us on a train with crypto machines, I believe it was.
Right.
Or sometimes, I think we just carried envelopes in our coat. We were supposed to blend in with the rest of the soldiers. And we had to be very careful about saying where we may go or what we were doing.
You really weren't supposed to even tell anybody you were a courier, is that right?
That's right.
Matter of fact, I think you told me about one soldier who blabbed a little bit that he was a courier, and
he got sent out that day.
Yeah.
I don't know where they sent him to.
Exactly. So nobody's supposed to really know what you were doing, much less what you were carrying with you. So
well, of course, we never knew either.
Right.
A lot of, until we started on the way back, after we delivered the merchandise or the envelopes or whatever it was, New York, I went up there about 25 times, I think it was, and never saw New York in the daytime.
So you didn't get to party much.
I remember now I went to the Kodak in
building?
in New York, so
Right.
evidently it had something to do with Kodak there. I remember a number of times I went there.
Right. And but your schedule was you would leave Washington usually in the afternoon, and you'd arrive at your destination, whether it was New York, in the middle of the night, 2, 3, 4 in the morning.
Right.
And then you'd arrive there late that evening and then have to get on the very next transport back.
Well,
right?
he ran about every hour at that time from New York to Washington, D.C. Regardless of what time you got back into Washington, D.C., you had to be down in the Pentagon that morning.
Because sometimes you wouldn't get back home till maybe 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning, and you grab yourself a nap and you'd be back at work the next day to find out where they were going to send you.
Yes.
Now, not all your trips were on the East Coast, you told me. A couple of times you went all the way cross country to San Francisco just to deliver something.
I remember I made 2 trips to San Francisco. We carried crypto machines, I believe it was. There was 2 of us that put us in the baggage car.
Of the train.
And we had to stay in that baggage car with those machines until we had them delivered to the proper headquarters.
In the 1940s, how long a trip was that by train from Washington to San Francisco?
Well, I think it was 2 nights, about 2 nights. I may be wrong.
Yeah, that's a long way.
Well, riding back, we could ride back in style. So but the major kept a good list of where we were and what train we were supposed to get back, and you better get back on that right train.
The fascinating thing is that every day when you went to work, you didn't know where you were going to be sent. And you, even as a courier, you were, I guess, asked to take things from one office to another right there in the Pentagon.
Yes.
A lot of it was right there in the Pentagon as far as delivery. But most of the time you were on the road. You were out or on the tracks, as it were, right? That's right.
I went to all the posts, almost Kansas, St. Louis. I don't know. We were constantly on the go.
Now, you told me one time that going to New York, you were able to finagle it a little bit to where you were able to make a little extra pocket money. How did that work?
Well, you had the volunteers at that time as a second lieutenant before they'd send you to Washington, D.C. Of course, I did that. I volunteered or signed a waiver. And the government would send us to on the outward trip. But if you wanted to, on your return trip, and it was legal, we could get a vacation ticket and make the little difference in the pay.
Because they'd pay you by the mile when you got back, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and that turned out to your benefit.
Yes, it did.
Well, you know, for a young soldier, that always came in handy, right?
That sure did.
Everything that you took, it was assigned to where you had to give it to a specific person, put it in someone's hand, and get a signature for that. That was part of your duty and part of your job, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating work, but then there was a whole other element to your service when later on you were transferred to the Pacific. Talk about how that came about.
Well, I was there in Washington, D.C., and they called, I didn't know where I was going, of course, but they sent a couple of officers down to an examination, and they failed their examination, and I went down to the doctor or captain, I think it was, something like that. He asked me what was wrong with you. What's wrong with you? I think he had got disgusted with the other fellows. And I said, well, not a whole lot. So I passed the physical exam, and I ended up going to San Francisco. And then I had actually orders to go to Australia, but in the meantime, they had taken out, I suppose, part of New Guinea, and I ended up in New Guinea at Ora Bay.
And your job that the Army gave you is that you were in charge of setting up several courier stations in different islands in the Pacific.
There was already one set up in Port Moresby. I think I set up the one in Ora Bay on Nadzab, and then I left there after they were still fighting in New Guinea.
Right.
And they got another courier transfer to go into New Guinea. And then later I ended up going to the Tacloban in the Philippines.
What exactly was involved in setting up these courier stations? I mean, you go in there, there's nothing there. You have to pretty much work from scratch to set up these courier stations. What all was involved in doing that?
Well, of course I had good orders that I could go to the headquarters always, without any question. And they had to furnish me with transportation, well, maybe a place for a little bit of an office or something like that.
Right.
And then I met these planes, like in Nadzab, and from there, when they established the courier station in Hollandia, I could transfer the stuff to the courier officer. But I would designate an officer that was leaving there to go to Hollandia, and he'd be met there in Hollandia by this courier transfer officer.
This concept of designating officers to be couriers, I found that very interesting, and that's the way that you got material, top secret material, whatever it was that you were ordered to transport from one place to another. You would relay it from one place to another, and you had the authority to actually designate couriers, officers who were higher rank even than you were. Talk about that whole system and how that worked. And I think later on you'll talk about one rather famous gentleman that you designated as a courier.
Well, we were given orders that, of course, I knew who would be on the plane ahead of time.
Right. And how many would be on the plane?
We would put the material on the plane, and then I had the papers and all of that, the authority, and then I'd go to the officer and tell him, now you're going to be a courier between here and Hollandia, maybe, as an example. And you're responsible for this material regardless of when you get there. And a lot of them objected to that because it was a responsibility, but I had the authority to do it, and I could take them off the plane if they didn't do what I told them to do.
So you could tell a higher ranking officer that here's this package, and I'm designating
and that was generally
you as a
higher ranking officers that were on the planes.
Because at the time you were what, still a second lieutenant or a first lieutenant?
I was a second lieutenant. I think sometime over there I got promoted to first lieutenant.
To first lieutenant. So you would go to these officers that were higher ranking than you and say, this package needs to get to where you're going.
That's right.
And you're going to be responsible for it. And if you refuse, I can take you off the airplane.
Right.
So you were lower ranked than them, but you could pull rank on them if you
sure
wanted
could.
to. And one time it turned out that one of the officers that you designated as a courier was who?
Was Charles Lindbergh.
Talk
he
about
was,
that.
I think he was either a lieutenant, I believe he was a lieutenant colonel. He was over there as an advisor. Mm-hmm. And but he was real nice, very, very nice. And today I wished I had that signature of that stuff he signed. But,
I'll bet you do.
All that was kept. I
Indeed.
didn't get to keep it.
You didn't get to keep any of that. Now, when you were over in the Pacific and New Guinea, your transport was by air, just exclusively, pretty much, right?
Exclusively by air, right.
I think you told me one time you personally flew in a B-25, and that wasn't a whole lot of fun.
Well, that was before the courier station, I believe, got into Hollandia. That's in the northern part. You know, the war was going forward. And I got up to Hollandia, and the only way that I could get back to, I think I was going to come back to Nadzam, I believe, was by, I got a ride in a B-25, I believe it was, in the back of the bubble up there.
Yes.
I didn't like that trip at all.
That was a little bit too close to the action
What
for
we
you,
had,
right?
what I had to do there, before these courier stations were established, if something came in that had to go to some headquarters, I can't remember the names, Topi or some of those places.
Right.
There were 2 officers at this place, myself and another officer. One of us had to deliver that by plane to the other headquarters.
Right.
And those planes were going back and forth all the time, of course.
We're going to come back to this fascinating story here in a minute, but I want to go to some photographs that you supplied for us that sort of span your service a little bit, not a whole lot of photographs, and I think we're about ready to put one of them up, and I want you to just sort of talk about these photographs, if you will. Here you go. I'm going to adjust this so we can get the glare out just a little bit. Talk about this photograph. Now, this was at Fort Sill, is that correct?
That's at Fort Sill.
And that's just one of your Army buddies, and was this just during the training, or what was that?
Right. I can see, we're looking just kind of laying over that 105 gun.
Is that you on the right?
Most of that training up there at Fort Sill as a second lieutenant was on the 105s.
Now, that's you. That's you, the handsome soldier on the right. Is that correct?
No, I'm on the left.
Oh, you're the handsome soldier on the left.
Yes,
okay.
sir.
I knew you were one of those handsome soldiers over there.
I like that hat.
Yeah, that was. That was. I guess that hat kept you out of the sun a little bit. Is that right? Is that right? And
incidentally, that was a 90-day. I was a 90-day wonder. You wonder how you finished it in 90 days.
Indeed, indeed. We're going to put another picture up here as soon as we get it. This is a picture of you. I think that this next picture that's coming up, and there it is. I believe that was taken at New Guinea. Talk a little bit about that photograph with in front of the aircraft.
A lot of those planes that came in had that little picture on there. That
the
plane
nose
there,
art.
I think,
Right.
is being repaired up at the engine. They changed the engines on some of those planes over there. That might have been what they were doing there. I don't know.
Right.
But that was at the airstrip where I was, and I went out there. They had my picture taken.
And that was an example of some of the transport that you would take in your business as a courier. Is that right?
Well, I think that's I'm not sure what plane that is. But I went at C-47s mostly for the transport planes.
Right, right.
They called it ATC at the time.
Right, right.
Air Transport Command.
What do you remember about New Guinea, about the country? What was it like? Obviously, the natives there were, it was during wartime, but it seemed like was it a friendly place to the American soldier?
Oh, yes. The Australians had complete control of the natives. The natives were jolly people. They all were, I think they died when they were young. They had no medical care early. But the natives would have what they call a sing-sing.
Yes.
Maybe a big bunch of them would get around there. They'd jump up and down and on that coral, their sole of their foot was about a couple inch or inch at least thick. And how they could walk on that sharp coral, I don't know. But they were all barefooted, of course.
Indeed.
But they liked to have sing-sings.
Indeed.
And they'd get out there in a circle and jump up and down.
Would you sing with them?
But no.
No, you wouldn't sing with them. Got one more photograph I want to show, and this is actually a piece of art that I just want you to tell us about. And there it is. I'm going to try to adjust it just a little bit here to where we can get a good, pardon my hand there. Talk about this. An artist did this. Talk about the Bonner Edmonds Meteor and Tex Edmonds.
Well, that drawing was made when I came back from overseas the second time. By a fellow named Lindbergh. There was also a sign there in San Francisco. He was assigned there, and he drew that picture of us, an old car that we bought. We had the dog as a mascot there at the office. There were about 8 or 10 other officers at this courier place in San Francisco. And that's where I spent a little time at the end of the war.
Don't know if folks can read it. It says the photo is the demon driving pair of Jay Bonner, who was from Alabama, and Tex Edmonds driving west On
He
to,
chose
to
us on the way to
California.
the Fairmont Hotel.
And you have actually the original. This is a photograph of the actual sketch, and
Yes,
you have that sketch at your home at a much larger scale and at a
Yes,
place of honor in your home.
Yeah,
Yeah. You're very proud of that.
I sure am.
Talk about you were given an emergency leave to come home,
Right.
and then talk about that, and then it leading to you going back. And very interesting story there when you came home and then had to go back again.
Well, I had left New Guinea and went up to Tacloban in the Philippines. And then an emergency leave came in. My mother was back home dying of cancer. I came back to the States and was able to visit with her a little bit before she died. And then I went back to San Francisco. And then I was assigned to a boat, a Liberty ship. I was and I found out later at that time I had the invasion maps of Japan
On that
on
boat.
the ship. So I was the only Army officer on the ship. There were 2 sergeants, as I remember, on there, but they were in charge of these trucks that were strapped down on the top. That's where I spent most of my nights sleeping on those trucks, a big seat. It was a very enjoyable trip back. Took about 30 days, as I remember, over that Liberty ship. I got to eat in the mess hall with the captain, of course, and the crew. And the only time something happened that I didn't care for was a Japanese subs come up. It was the only time, and they shot 2 rounds at us, but both rounds went over. I might mention too, while we were going over there, we saw a lot of several mines. They were about the size of 5 baby basketballs, and had prongs sticking out.
Right.
And our crew tried to shoot them, but all they had was rifles. They never did hit one. So the ship just finally went on. So those might be floating today. I don't know.
It really gave you an idea of how dangerous this war was, especially for cruise ships in the Pacific, because you got a taste of that as you were going back over with the 2 shots at you from the submarines. But that's quite interesting, is that part of your cargo were the maps for what was supposed to be a ground invasion of Japan, which of course never came to be.
Unfortunately, we never did have to use that.
Indeed. And you've talked to me before about that, and you were one of the many veterans who believed that the decision by President Truman at the time to drop the bomb on Hiroshima, while it took a lot of lives, it saved a lot of lives. And you're a big believer in that.
It saved lives of the Japanese and the Americans. I'm sure it did.
Indeed. Indeed. A lot of people feel the same way. I believe it was at about this time that you were, I guess you were trying to get where you were, and there was bad weather, and you got the services of a tugboat. Talk about how you did that.
Well, when this ship came in and anchored out there, I believe 50, I'm not sure, and there was a storm. One way or the other, I got in with the captain of the ship. They had a boat out for us. And I was able to go to the headquarters 8th Army and be relieved of the material I had there. And then I went down to the harbor master to get a boat to take me back out to the ship to get my gear off there. But he wouldn't do it because of the storm. So I went down and found a guy that had a tug.
Right.
And I offered him 2 quarts of American whiskey. I had taken 4 of them over from the States, from my friends over there, and I had 4. But anyway, he went out there, took me out there to the ship, and I didn't have any trouble getting on the ship. But then he went up there the first time and broke the ladder on the ship. And then he made a turn out there, and he informed me that unless I got on there that time, he was going back in. So I started to jump into the water, and the old sailor, thank goodness, he grabbed me by the arm, and said, if you jump in there, that propellers on that tug will chew you to pieces. So
that's good advice.
I was fortunate. The tug came up there, and I finally dropped on top. I got in. The headquarters, the 8th Army. Then I had orders to go with the 8th Army to set up a courier station in Yokohama.
And I believe that was certainly, you were one of the first units actually in Japan after the war and set up that courier station in Japan.
They didn't have any transportation up there at the time, and I was one of the first in there at that time. The Japanese people, though, were very cooperative. You could walk down the street at night. There was no problem.
Right. I guess the people were just as relieved that the war was over as the Americans were.
And I would say they were very hungry, too.
Right.
I remember one time they had in a warehouse, and they got a bunch of canned goods out of there. They started distributing them down the street. Those people were getting them, and they didn't have Japanese language on there.
Indeed.
They'd been held in that warehouse all that time.
Major Edmonds, we just have a little over a minute now. Real quickly, I know your wife, Eleanor, also served our country in Korea. Talk just a little bit about her service.
Well, she went through basic training over at, I believe it's Lackland.
Right.
And then she went to, I believe, Maxwell Air Base in Alabama, I believe it is.
Right.
And that's where she spent most of her time.
Indeed, and I know that both of you are very involved too in VFW
I think she
activities.
handled some confidential material there. She was in the headquarters there. I understand.
Indeed, and both of you are very involved in the VFW here now, and very proud of that and the work that you all do here locally with the VFW.
I sure am.
Indeed. Thank you very much for visiting with us. We're
Well,
very proud
I
of
want
your
to say
service.
I certainly do appreciate your service to the veterans in every respect.
Thank you. Thank you, Major Edmonds. As with any war, superior communication is vital to success. And as the man who set up and administered courier transfer stations in the Pacific, Major W.S. Edmonds' role in our war effort was essential to victory. Like every man and woman who spent the prime years of their youth in harm's way, we salute Major W.S. Edmonds, Aggie Class of 38, veteran, World War II. Please thank a veteran today, and thanks to our underwriter, First National Bank. I'm Tom Turbeville. Please join us next time on Veterans of the Valley.